of the matters, well, there were two matters of interest at our Perth conference. One was we had the Queen's former private secretary who suggested that Sir John Kerr might have waited a few days, which I found very interesting. And the other was in relation to a premier of an Australian state. They're also called prime ministers. This is before Federation. Charles Kingston was the prime minister or premier of South Australia, and he came to the Constitutional Convention with a proposal to introduce a degree of direct democracy into the Australian Constitution. He had it all printed by the state printer of South Australia, but he was talked out of it by Alfred Deakin, who subsequently became Prime Minister. Deakin said, look, with responsible government, that is a government being made on the floor of the House of Representatives, you effectively have the same thing. It will be like direct democracy. What Deakin didn't know, or perhaps he did know, was that the parties would solidify. We would have a very firm two-party system in due course, and that the sort of control which the people could exercise through their representatives disappeared because all members of Parliament, almost all members of Parliament, belong to one side or the other. There are a few in the centre, but you don't have much control over them. So that was abandoned, that idea that we have direct democracy. It was to require that any new bill be set aside and that the people have the time to raise by petition a referendum on any new bill in the Australian Parliament. But that didn't happen. It's not in the American federal constitution. Do you think it should be? Do you think there should be a provision for direct democracy, for the people to petition for the making of laws or the repeal of laws in the United States?
Well, as Winston Churchill once said, and I'm sure you heard this quote, is that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other kinds have been tried from time to time. So it can be messy. But yes, I do think direct democracy is, America is a representative republic. And especially when, a subject we're not going to get into today, but the Electoral College, and it was designed specifically that way so that it's not a direct democracy. But I much prefer the Swiss model, where people can propose legislation, they can contest legislation, they can propose referendums. And so I think it can be messy, but I think you have to trust the people.
And in America, you're getting much more of a tight party system. There was much more freedom in the past between the Republicans and the Democrats. There was more discussion and more of a tendency to vote, not according to the party line, but what seems to have emerged is a very rigid distinction. I won't say which party is more to blame than the other, but that certainly has happened.
Yeah.
And it's gone along with a failure to accept the president, particularly on great occasions, important issues, as being a ruler above the fray. I think that started probably in modern times. It certainly existed soon after Federation, but it started again in modern times, I think, with President Johnson. You got an enormous division, and we've seen an enormous division with President Trump. And but that fact that you have this division, such a strict division, and people keeping to the party line means that the antidote for that, I think, is more direct democracy.
I think so too, but I also think that because the Australian Constitution is, in my view, an evolution of the American Constitution, and it's a best, and the Westminster system, and it's a beautiful combination of both. That because of that, I think, not in spite of it, that a prime minister, which I was interested to find out, is not actually mentioned in the Constitution. But the prime minister serves with the confidence of the House, That's not the case in America. And you can build a coalition of multiple parties, obviously, in the Westminster system, which you can't do in America. Third-party candidates have really had almost no traction for 100 years in America. If a third-party candidate comes and gets any votes, they're just taking them from one or the other of the major parties.
Yes.
So I think you're absolutely right. I like the idea of more direct democracy, and I think that with the Westminster system, I think you get a wider variety of opinions rather than farther left and farther right.
I've looked at the Swiss referendums, and I haven't agreed with some, of course. You don't agree with everything, but I think on the whole, there's been a wisdom there. I think they have made some very sensible decisions, which have improved. There's also a greater sense of accountability on the part of the politicians, who in Switzerland quite often are part-time and share offices, and don't have the airs and graces of an Australian politician. And I think there's an advantage in that. There's an advantage in
the other thing
control.
that I think is remarkable about their system is there's no executive. There's the executive council of 7 people elected by Parliament to rotate, and they have a president, but that's really just a ceremonial role, president of the council. But they're essentially governed by, it's essentially, I think, a way of preventing authoritarian rule if you rule in that way. And I don't know how it works exactly because I've not lived there or had any direct experience with that. But I like the idea of it.
I think we also have to remember that Switzerland is not a world power, and it hasn't been in a war since its civil war in the middle of the 19th century, and then when it was occupied by Napoleon. So it's not a country which has an international role. We've been involved in every war with the United States since the First World War, and we were involved with Britain in every colonial war, and the United States has been involved in a number of major wars. I think our roles are very different. It may well work in Switzerland to an extent in not having such an executive.